Hi, you're listening to Marcia Pally and conversations I'm having with people about the criteria we should use to design and implement our economic and political policies. What should be our basic framework for determining public policy? These conversations are based on ideas from a book of mine, Commonwealth and Covenant, Economics, Politics, and Theologies of Relationality, because we're looking specifically at relationality as this framework for policy. Relationality includes both the individual person and the relations and contexts that he or she is in. Relationality is developed in many of our philosophical traditions and also in several theological traditions. Whether you think theologies are the word of the divine or an illuminating metaphor, in both cases they offer us much about how the world and people work, and so about the policies that will lead to the greatest human flourishing. Please join us in this series of conversations. Commonwealth and Covenant was published by Erdman's Press in 2016. You can follow me at marciapally.com or search for me on Facebook and Twitter. So I'd like to start our conversation today by reviewing one or two points that we discussed last time, because it gives us a chance to clarify one or two ideas. The first is, why were we discussing the interpretation of religious violence in the Bible, which we did last time? What's the point of doing that? In particular, of the conquest tales. The point that I wanted to make is about how we read the Bible and how we have to be aware and bring the proper tools to read it. They're very, very well-known stories, and often they're read literally, which makes them a good case to discuss the issue of how to read a text that's 2,500 years old. And it's written in forms that precede the Greco-Hellenistic logic forms that we've inherited. When you read the conquest tales, you realize that they are inconsistent both within the story and inconsistent externally, so to speak, within the larger context. This should immediately tip one off that a literal reading is not going to be the most productive, and that one has to look very closely into the format in which the stories are written and into the understanding of the authors and the audiences of the time. The inconsistencies within the story is that, of course, in Deuteronomy, the stories are set off by a prohibition against going to war unless you first make a request for peace. That is the law that the ancient Hebrew tribes are abiding by, laws that were kept up in the rabbinic period as well, and in the medieval period, and so on. The story is also inconsistent internally because it tells a tale of extensive conquest and then immediately goes on to talk about those presumably annihilated tribes as continuing to live right where they always had in the land of Canaan, and relations between the Hebrew tribes and the Canaanite tribes were overall good. So there's an internal inconsistency. First, all the Canaanite tribes wiped out, and then as you keep reading, they're still there and being highly active and interacting with the Hebrew tribes for centuries. Again, what does this mean? Obviously, we can't read the text literally. We have to ask what the purpose of the text is. And my point of bringing this up is to remind us that when we're reading a text at this distance from its authorship, and that is a text that is written in different formats from the ones that we've inherited from the Greco-Hellenistic culture, that we have to ask what the purpose of the stories was at the time of authorship, and then one could possibly mean for us today. The second thing that I wanted to raise was an answer to Angelica's question. She last time asked, well, isn't the Kantian categorical imperative a better grounding for ethics than the ground for ethics that we're talking about? And I thought about what she was asking and what the theologies of relationality are suggesting for a ground for ethics. The relational theologies ground their ethics of reciprocal regard on what we've been talking about as the setup of the way things are. That we are differentiated beings who become who we are through multiple layers of interaction throughout our entire lives. We saw when we were looking at the neurobiologist Darciana Narvaez that she also says if you want to look to human flourishing, you would do well to look at how human beings are as a species, how they're set up. And this will give you a better base to move forward and discover what might be advantageous or promote human flourishing. And that's the assumption of theologies of relationality. We are distinct beings, but we can't survive, let alone flourish, without multiple layers of relationship. And it's from that the ethics come. Now, because relational theologies are theology, they also propose that this setup of us, that we are differentiated, we're each separate, we're unique, but we become who we are through our relations to people near, more obviously family, community, and so on, but also people who might not live near us at all, the people who decide our education, our economic, or nutrition, or healthcare, and so on. Relational theologies ground that in theology, that distinction, we're different, yet relation, we become who we are through our multiple relations, comes from not only the way we're set up, but from the way everything is set up, from the way existence is set up, because we are radically different from the cause of causes, whatever sets everything up, whatever is the ground for existence per se, and yet we are in intimate relation with whatever is the ground for existence. As Aquinas says, that must work intimately in us in order for us to exist at all. So the theologies of relationality try to ground ethics first in our human setup, and then ground our human setup in the setup of existence per se. So it tries to be as solid as it can, as in a way untheoretical, but rather as grounded as it possibly can, working from the human setup to the setup of existence in a very basic way. Last time we talked about this setup for existence in terms of covenant. That the nature of the relationship, when we say the ground for existence is in us, in being metaphorical, in order for us to exist at all, that's a covenantal relationship, that's what's meant by covenant. A bond of reciprocal care and regard for the other, of giving for the flourishing of the other. And that's why we were studying covenant last time, because it's a way to talk about the grounding for existence, per se, and including our existence with each other. And we talked about this Möbius strip idea, the intertwinedness of covenant, that we have a covenant with the ground or reason, the cause of causes, for all of existence. That's a covenantal relationship. And because that is in us, that sets us up, that's our setup, we have the capacity to be distinct yet covenantal with each other. So covenant is a way to speak of both the ground for all existence and the ground for our relationality with each other, our distinction and yet our relation. And from this comes the ethics. And we're discussing it on the idea that this is a fairly solid grounding for ethics, because it comes from the setup. It comes from the way we are and the way existence is structured. And we are now going to start to use concepts like covenant, and today we're going to move on to talk about Trinity and other theological concepts as ways of talking and expressing this fundamental setup. I'm going to then move into the discussion of distinction amid relations, separability amid situatedness in the voice of the Trinitarian discourse. What does that sound if we're talking about it through the imagery, the ideas, the principles, the symbology of Trinity? So the first thing that we'll notice, of course, is that the Trinity appears to be a paradox. 3 in 1, 1 in 3, or what is that all about? And but we should note that the fact that the divine is paradoxical, at least until we look at it very closely, was already an idea in the Judaic concept of the divine before the Christian concept of the divine. A couple of examples. God is transcendent and incorporeal, immaterial, without a body, and yet immanent on earth and in relationship with us all the time. Somehow, God is incorporeal and yet here. The Hebraic tetragrammaton, Yud-He Vav-He, as the name for God, which we don't know how to pronounce, but which we attempt to pronounce by saying Yahweh, contains the words for was, is, and will be. That God was, God is, and God will be, which is not only a paradox, but a triune paradox. It's a Trinitarian paradox. God exists outside of time, and yet also exists in the real past in time, in the real present in time, and in the real future in time. Distinction amid relation is expressed in a number of primary principles of the Trinity. So we're going to move with the apparent paradox and plunge right in and look how what this paradox has to tell us about our theologies of relationality, or our principles of relationality. Let me quote first from Hans von Balthasar. The principles of individuality and community are at work together simultaneously in Trinity. The three comprise the one, so that the person makes demands and imposes conditions on the community, and the community does likewise in respect of the persons. For only in this sense can God, in fact, be loved. In the Godhead, therefore, individuality and community have a common origin. So that's one way to think about the Trinity. Individually and community have a common origin, and individuality and community are one in the Trinity. To continue, I'm going to quote from James Torrance. The person is not just an individual, but as someone who finds his or her true being in communion with God and with others. The person is a counterpart of the Trinitan doctrine of God. Now here, James Torrance is specifically saying that we are in the image of a Trinitarian God, and therefore, if God is one in communion, three distinct persons of the Trinity in communion, and we are in the image of a Trinitarian God, then we also are persons in communion. Here's Thomas Aquinas: the Trinitarian persons who mutually constitute each other and the Godhead as a whole teach us also about the human condition. The triune God is, after all, what humanity partakes of. Right? If we have in us, metaphorically, something of God, the cause of causes, to exist at all, and that is individuality and community, then that's what is in us in order to exist at all. Yes?
One more question. What does it mean, the Trinitarian persons?
So the Trinity has three persons, metaphorically, because person is a human term: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Okay, so that's what it means.
That's what it means.
I was
Good question.
And the triune God is, what does it mean, the expression, the triune God?
That the God that is one God,
yes,
made up of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which are individual persons and yet one. That's what triune means. Tri, three in one unity. Thank you very much. Good. Are we okay?
Yeah.
And finally, I'll quote from a young contemporary theologian, Jonathan Wilson Hartgrove: the God who is three persons in community creates humanity in the image of community. Meaning, again, we are distinct persons, but we are in relation, in community. And that is because we are in the image of a triune God. Now, it took a while in the development of Christianity for this concept to fully develop in the first several centuries of the early church. Initially, the Roman Church did description of the Trinity was not as three hypostasis, the underlying of each thing, the underlying substance of each three, but as the Latin persona, persons with distinct features, which allowed for more distinction among Trinitarian persons. This runs the risk of tritheism. If you use the word person, as you just asked about, to describe the three persons of the Trinity, this is a Latin root, runs the risk of sounding like you've got three gods here. To avoid tritheism, the Roman, yes?
May I add something, because the Latin word of persona also means mask. So we have personas on the stage. So personae, and so this means three different, put on masks.
Yes.
It's the problem of thinking too much in terms of a person.
Yeah, and that could create a distancing of the idea of mask. To avoid these problems, the Roman Church emphasized the Trinity's unity. But if you emphasize the unity, the oneness might be a better word, then it's difficult to explain relation, because to have relations, you have to have distinct persons. This is the paradox and the difficulty of understanding the concept. The Cappadocian Fathers of the Eastern Church, in response to the oneness of the Roman emphasis, accentuated the concept of perichoresis, to accentuate the relationality. And in some sense, the mystery and the paradox and the wonder of relationality, that you have oneness or individuality, and you have relationality, and the relations make the whole one, of which each Trinitarian person is a part. I want to unpack that a little, because there's two ways in which there's a oneness. There's oneness in the sense of the individuality of the Trinitarian persons, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. These are in relation, and their relationness to each other creates the one that is God. And that's the second way we're using the idea of one. First, we have the one in the sense of individual person of the Trinity in relation, forming the one unity that is God at all. So let's talk a little bit about the Cappadocian Fathers' concept of perhoresis, roughly meaning pera, around, horesis, from dancing around. The concept where each is who he is in relation to, dancing with, the others. These relations constitute the whole of the dance in which the three persons are. Here's again the idea of persons individually in a dance, so to speak, and the dance is the whole in which, or the unity in which the individuals are. If you think of a ballet, without the specific character of each movement in relationship to all the other movements, each gesture is only a random jab. It's not a movement in a dance, because as an isolated individual gesture, it's not in the process of constituting a dance for each movement to be part of. In isolation, the individual movements in a dance are not accumulating to comprise a dance. So they're simply random gestures. They are not movements of a dance. But when you put them together in a dance, each movement in relation to all others transforms every movement, each one of them, from a random gesture into a gesture of the dance, because movement in relation makes a dance a unity for all gestures to be part of. Each movement gives the other the identity of not being a poke, a random gesture, but a dance movement. The Cappadocian Fathers in Trinity said analogously that the identity of each Trinitarian person, the separate identity, like a separate dance movement, and the relations among them makes each movement, each Trinitarian person, what it is, a person of the Godhead, and also constitutes the unity of the Godhead, of which each is a part. As the Trinitarian persons are distinct, each with its, quote, own particular distinguishing notes, as Gregory of Nyssa said, yet each is equal in constituting the unity of which the individuals are a part. As Edith Stein, the German Jewish philosopher who converted to Catholicism and became a Discalced Carmelite sister, said, quote, I am, in the Trinity, I am is identical in meaning with I give myself totally to you. I am one with you, and so identical with we are. I am is identical with we are. Another characteristic of the Trinitarian imagery is that each person of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, gives to the other, gives identity to the other, the three together making the one of which each is a part, and the giving, the donation, is without exhaustion. You don't get used up. If we imagine that we are in the image of a God or of a cause of causes that gives without getting used up, it suggests, if that is what we are in the image of, if that is what is in us in order to exist, then giving for us might not mean loss, but actually may mean that we get much more back in return. Here's Aaron Ritchie's on this point. On this view, personhood is analogically grounded in the pattern of Trinitarian perichoresis, which means that the self, renunciation for the other, does not exhaust the I. Rather, there occurs a reverse restoration of the I. And this unlocks the paradox of theosis, becoming deiform in the form of God, more like God, involves receiving all what is from another in the dialogue of love. Aaron Ritchie's is talking to us, not to God, that giving of the self does not exhaust the self, but restores the self. And by doing so, we become closer more to God, more deiform, as we receive more of who we are from the other, and as we give more of who we are to the other. According to Aaron Ritchie's, this non-exhaustion of Trinitarian giving is also how our setup is. Daniel Bell, following the medieval philosopher and theologian Anselm, also rejects the binary between caring for oneself and caring for another, where help to another means loss to the self. Perichoresis proposes, he writes, that we can give ourselves as a gift of love to our neighbors without end and without loss. Daniel Bell goes on to say, this allows one to overcome the modern illusion of the isolated, alienated self and the masculine fantasy of absolute self-possession, because in giving, the self is not deprived, doesn't lose, but is enhanced.